Several years ago, a neuroscientist named Antonio Damasio did research on people with damage to the emotion centers of their brains. I hope you can hear me. Let me know if you can't. So what he found looking at these people was that in most regards, they were just like everyone else. They had normal attention and memory. But one thing they couldn't do was make decisions. And I'm not talking about big, important decisions like what car to buy or where to live or who to marry. I'm talking about the everyday decisions of where am I going to eat lunch and when do I schedule this appointment. In these situations where most of us would just decide to walk across the street to Quiznos, these people would tend to spend tons of time making these extensive pro and con lists all before they could decide on what to do. And without emotion, there's a good chance that that's what all of us would spend all of our time doing. There's a lot of research now that says that emotion is what helps us to cut through the complex situations of daily life and decide on a course of action. Now, a lot of people are surprised when they hear about this line of research, not because we think that emotion doesn't matter, but we do. It's been a long time since we really saw ourselves as purely rational beings, although the last talk did present some people who think otherwise. But we do tend to have a bias when it comes to emotion. And you can see it in the language that we use to talk about emotion. We describe it as fluffy and touchy-feely, and we very rarely see it as something that we can objectively observe or quantify. And this can make it very difficult to make it a priority in our product designs. But research like Damasio shows that ignoring emotion is one of the worst things we can do for our products, because these same sorts of everyday decisions that users are making all the time are the same decisions they're often making multiple times a day about your product. So today I'd like to talk about emotional design, though perhaps not in the way that UX practitioners typically talk about it. Don Norman and others have already written plenty of books on the hows and whys of emotional design. But I'd like to talk about what comes next. So once you've made a commitment to emotional design, you've decided to include these sorts of experiences in your product, how do you know that you're doing it successfully? So I'm going to talk about different approaches we can take for understanding the emotional impact our products have, as well as some psychophysiological measures that can help us to do this more objectively. And I'd like to share my own team's journey towards learning how to quantify delight in our product experiences. So there are a lot of different approaches we can take to understanding the emotional response users have to products. I would imagine that a lot of people here have probably reported on the body language of participants in user sessions. And those unguarded moments where a user leans in or really smiles or just looks really horrified by something that's going on, these unguarded moments are great ways to understand what users are feeling, even if they aren't actually telling you about it. There are also a number of word and picture banks that we can use to give users to help users be more descriptive about their emotional experience. And I don't know how many of you have ever asked a user to describe what their experience is with a product. They tend to not be very descriptive. They say a lot of things like it's very cool, it's nice. Clean is the big one. Everyone says that every design is clean lately, which doesn't tell you much about their emotional state. So giving them a word bank like this is just a way of helping them to find the right word that may not be coming straight to mind. This particular example is from Joey Benedict. He was one of the early pioneers in a lot of this emotional software testing, and he was a Microsoft researcher. So if you want to bring a little more rigor to your emotional testing, there are always survey items, Likert type scales, and semantic differentials. This particular example is a lot of fun. This is a smiley-ometer that's used for testing with kids. And I do a bit of research with kids, and they have a really hard time telling you what they're feeling. So by having them just point at a smiley face, it can express a lot more. And there's any number of other more specialized techniques we can use to gauge emotional responses. This is a perception analyzer or dial. This is that knob testing you always hear about in television research where people can turn it up or down to tell you about their experience. And there are a lot of other things that processes that people like to use, things like the Kano methodology, Shira interviewing, repertory grids. Everyone kind of has their own favorites, and these are all fine and great ways of understanding what users are feeling about products. But they all have a few limitations. There's one big problem with most of these measures, which is that with the exception of body language, they're all types of self-report, which means they are subject to a certain amount of bias. And actually a bigger issue when you're talking about emotion in particular is that more and more research shows that people have a very hard time articulating what they're experiencing and feeling. And part of that is not having the right words to use, but part of it is that we just don't always know ourselves what's going on beneath the surface. So if we don't know, we certainly can't tell a researcher about it. There are also issues with continuity of the measures. So most of those measures are designed to look at kind of the cumulative experience, the cumulative emotional experience, and not looking at the experience on a second-by-second basis. The dial is the best example of something that would do that, but you're still asking users to make discrete decisions about, well, am I feeling about an 80 or an 85 right now? And a lot of times when they get really into an experience, they'll start forgetting to turn the dial at all, so you miss the best part. So that's one issue. The other thing to mention is that most of these measures are more qualitative than quantitative. Now, that's not a bad thing. Qualitative emotional measures are a great way of understanding the rich complexities of the emotional response people are having. But it isn't a good way to make graded comparisons. That's just not what the measures are made for. So what do you do if you do want to make a more precise emotional comparison between two different experiences, or you do want to have a measure that is a little more objective or that does get this kind of continuous second-by-second readout? Well, these are cases where psychophysiological measurement become very compelling. And I'll call this both psychophysiological measurement and biometrics. One's just easier to say. But psychophysiological measurement basically comes down to the responses of the body. So anytime you are feeling an emotion, your body is going through a discrete set of physiological reactions. And we can measure those reactions by placing sensors on the body. Now, biometrics are not only used for emotion. You'll also see them used for things like attention and memory and cognitive load. But for today, I'm really going to focus on the emotional aspect of biometrics, and specifically two dimensions of emotion, which are valence and arousal. And I'll go through what each of these are. So valence is basically how positive or negative the emotion is. So anytime you're feeling happy or pleasant surprise, that would be a positively valenced emotion. And if you're feeling frustrated or sad or angry, that's a negatively valenced emotion. So there's a few different ways of looking at this, but one of the classic ones is facial electromyography, or EMG. So how many people have heard of EMG in other contexts? Okay, so a few. So EMG is actually used all over the body. It's just a way of reading from different muscles and seeing what their activation level is. But if we use it on the muscles of the face, then that tells us about how people are feeling. So the most obvious example here is if you place it on your zygomaticus major, or the cheek muscle, you can tell when people are smiling. And some people also like to place a sensor on the orbicularis oculi, which is the muscle around your eye. And the feeling is that this gives you a better sense of a true smile. It makes it a little more complicated, but these are both measures that we can use to get at positive emotion. Now, for negative emotion, we have a different muscle that we read from. It's the corrugator supercilii, which is up near your brow. So when you tense your brow, that's what you're doing. And this has been shown to be a good negative emotional indicator. So when you see activation in that muscle, it means that people are generally getting frustrated. Although it can also mean they're concentrating, so it gets a little bit more ambiguous. Now, you might be thinking, I've watched people use products, they're not constantly smiling and frowning. So how useful is this measure going to be? Well, fortunately, facial EMG is a very sensitive measure, and it can pick up on signals that are not actually visible to a human observer. So that can be better for those less intense emotional experiences like you have with products. or software products. So the second measure I wanted to talk about today is physiological arousal. And this one is a little less intuitive, but you can basically think of it as how intense the emotion you're experiencing is. So when you're feeling very, very excited, or you're feeling just super, super angry, these would both be examples of high physiological arousal. Now, we tend to measure arousal using a measure called skin conductance. And this basically works by reading from the sweat on your palms and feet. I know that sounds very strange. It's hard to think of why that would relate to arousal. There are some theories about why this happens, which relate to being able to grip things better in fight or flight scenarios. But regardless of the reason why, it has been shown to be a very reliable indicator of how intensely people are feeling emotions. So this is the measure that we tend to use for arousal. You might have heard different terms for it, galvanic skin response or electrodermal activity, but they basically come down to this same general idea. One thing to be cognizant of if you do decide to ever use skin conductance is that any measure of arousal is going to be non-valenced. And what that means is it's not inherently positive or negative. So that intense excitement I was just talking about, or that like very strong frustration and anger, those are going to show up the same way. And so you need to plan in other ways of understanding what the positivity or negativity of the experience is. So, sorry. Psychophysiological measures are very powerful, but like anything, they have their limits. One thing that probably we've all run into is that biometrics are very costly to set up. It requires a lot of equipment. It's getting a lot more user-friendly and accessible, but it's still not to the point where everyone can do this. The bigger issue is actually on the analysis side, because you're just getting so much data, and you have to do a lot of rectifying and smoothing, so it's not just a simple procedure. So you want to have a pipeline in place to help speed that along if you do a lot of this. Another issue is movement artifacts and duration. So what I mean by this is there are a lot of little things that can affect the integrity and quality of your data in biometrics, things that we wouldn't normally think of. One thing is movement. So if you're having users move the mouse a whole lot, it can affect some of the measures. Another thing is duration. So you tend to see drift in these measures as time goes on. So we want to keep our studies short, and we want to keep people pretty still. Another issue, and actually I think this is the biggest one that people don't realize, but this is around experience intensity. So a lot of times when we hear about these awesome biometric studies that have been run, what we don't realize is that they're being done with these very intense emotional experiences. So you usually hear about see an article this time of year about how biometrics was used on the Super Bowl ads. And of course, those are intended to be the funniest and most dramatic ads of the year. When these measures are used in psychology, they might be used with just static images, which sounds pretty low intensity, right? It actually turns out that these are very intense static images. So on one end of the spectrum, you're talking about mutilations and gore, and on the other end is full-on pornography. So when we try to compare our software experiences with something with that level of emotional intensity, we need to be prepared that we might not get signals that are quite as strong. And we need to design studies with that in mind. The last thing I want to mention is emotional reductionism, and this is something that you can probably all sense intuitively, but when you're talking about something as complex and rich as emotion, anytime you talk about paring that down to just a single dimension, such as valence or arousal, you are losing something in the translation. So this is not to replace those qualitative measures that can give us that richer view, but it's great for specific types of situations. So biometrics is by no means a magic bullet that will fix all of the emotional issues with your product, but it is a very powerful tool that, when used well, can tell us a lot of things that there's really no other way of learning. So, now that I've shared a little bit about how these measures work, I'd like to talk about how we've used them ourselves to quantify delight in our experiences. I am a user researcher at Bing, and Bing is a search engine that has really grown a lot in the last few years. We started with a fairly small number of users, but we're up to the point now where 1 out of every 5 searches in the US is being done through Bing. So we're answering a lot of people's questions and providing a lot of information every day. But from the beginning, Bing has tried to connect with users not only through their minds, but also through their hearts. And one of the best ways of seeing this is our daily homepage image. So Bing has a homepage photo that changes each day. It's selected by our content programming team. And it's selected to bring a different perspective on the world, something that'll raise a little bit of curiosity. And it's just one of several features on Bing that are designed to give users a little bit of joy and delight throughout their day. So that's one of our real design priorities. However, Bing is also a very data-driven company. I'm sure a lot of you can relate to that. So we are constantly doing tests and experiments to better understand how we can improve the search experience. And in those cases, a lot of times we can use click data to give us a pretty good sense of what users are experiencing. We can see things like satisfaction and engagement and proxies of loyalty, all using things like where people click and how long they stay on a page and how often they come back. But there are some experiences where there's really no amount of click data that can tell you what you need to know. And the homepage is a great example of that. There is nowhere that users can click that's going to tell me what a user feels when they look at this awesome picture of this gecko. So when we're trying to understand whether we've been successful in achieving delight for our users, traditionally, we've had to approach this using a lot of those non-physiological measures of emotion that I mentioned earlier. So we've done a lot of those word bank tests, a lot of the surveys and everything. And it's been good for giving us a general sense that, yes, people do like the homepage, it is delightful, and that's all working very well for us. But over the past few years, the Bing homepage team has been trying to really push the experience and increase that feeling of delight by experimenting in different ways with the homepage. So one thing that we've been doing is introducing movements into the homepages. So instead of just seeing a static image of this gecko, it might be flicking its tail. Last year we introduced audio, so on Mardi Gras on Tuesday you could click and hear a jazz band. That was a lot of fun. There are also things like panoramas, and then on holidays and special occasions, we'll often have special interactive experiences that you can go and really play around with. So the goal of these is to increase the sense of user delight, but there is a certain amount of cost involved with creating each of these experiences. And so we've been looking for ways to understand whether we are actually having the kind of impact that we think we're having. And this is where a lot of those non-physiological measures kind of start to break down, because it's very hard to compare the level of delight people have looking at a static image versus the level of delight they have looking at something that's moving. So we decided that biometrics was the best approach to answer this question. So we began to design a study around looking at lower delight experiences and higher delight experiences. We approached it very much like any other A/B test. We had one version that was our low delight and one version that was high delight, and we wanted to see whether people would actually show a corresponding increase in emotional levels. But as we were doing this, we started to realize that we had an opportunity to see what else we can do with biometrics. And so we started to ask other questions. One question was about visual design. Can we look at bland designs versus flashy designs and see if they show any corresponding increase there? That didn't turn out to be super insightful. But another thing that we decided to look at was feature value. And this is very nebulous. It's definitely not something that we can purely and completely settle in one study, but we wanted to see whether biometrics can tell us which types of features resonate with people. And the way that we approached this was by creating a different set of user stories that showcased a user problem and showed how Bing could help them to solve it. So this was our basic framework for the study. And that was very helpful. I do recommend having a set of questions like this if you're doing biometrics. It's amazing how many people will decide to do a biometric study and just come in with a website and say, okay, let's do biometrics on this. So you do want to structure it just like any other study. But we had a lot of decisions to make up front about how to design this to maximize our chances of actually getting a signal. So as I mentioned before, biometrics is usually used with other types of experiences. So we were really figuring a lot of this out as we went. So our first question was which measure to use. We decided to use facial EMG for a variety of reasons, one being the sensitivity that I mentioned earlier. So there are a lot of very sophisticated automated facial coding solutions that are starting to become available. And these are ways of sort of doing an automated facial EMG. But we had concerns about the sensitivity not being quite as good. And since the emotional experience of a search engine is a little subtle, we wanted to stack the deck in our favor. Facial EMG is also very instantaneous, so you see kind of immediate reactions, whereas something like skin conductance is a little slower. Our second question was, do we do this ourselves or do we do this with a vendor? The vendor was a huge time savings because they already have that pipeline in place. But one thing that helped a lot was having somebody in-house who did know a fair bit about biometrics. And finally, we had to decide what format to use for our stimuli. And this can be, you basically have two options, which is to have users interact directly with the product, or you can show them a video. Interacting directly seems better, but it introduces that movement. And it also means that users are getting different experiences, and that reduces the power of your study. So in our case, we created 10 different videos, 2 for our delightful experience, and 6 for our user stories, and then the 2 for the design that I'm not going to talk about. So once we created our 10 videos, we put them into the field with our participants. And this is a typical study setup. We had users come in one at a time for all 60 of our participants. The process was they would come in, they'd be hooked up to the electrodes, we'd get a baseline reading, and then they would watch the 10 different videos. Once they were done, we would unhook them, and then they completed a questionnaire to give us some firsthand feedback on the experience. And this is a model of the data that this generated. So up at the top, you can see that we have the video that the participant watched. And then synced with that down below are our 2 different emotional measures. And there are 2 because we had the positive emotion and the negative emotion. So the green line is our positive emotional measure. In general, we'd like that to be high. And the negative emotional measure is the blue line, which we'd like to see low. So let's get into the data. So our first question was the impact of delightful content. And this was our most pressing and immediate question. So as I mentioned, we had an A version of a video and a B version of a video. And we tried to keep this as controlled as possible. So we have users go through the same sequence of steps. And in one case, they have the low delight content. In one case, it's the high delight content. So in video A, you're going to see a static video, a static homepage image, followed by a search that we thought would be a little boring for most people, which was for the Dow Jones Industrial Average. So here's the video. So this one doesn't have audio. They're going in, doing their search. The homepage image is not moving. And then they track this as an interest. And go back and see the result of that. So, very short video. We were able to get some interesting data out of it. So I'll just walk through this. This is the same data you just saw in the video. All in all, there's not a whole lot of movement here. The biggest change that we see is at the very beginning, the green line bumps up above 110. So that does seem to indicate that users are kind of delighted by that homepage image, but then it just falls off and people stay kind of low level for the rest of the experience. Same thing with the negative emotion, which is the blue line. It starts out pretty low and just tends to increase. So now let's look at our second experience. So this experience is the exact same sequence, except the homepage image is now moving, and they do a search that's a little more interesting for snowboarding. Okay, so the same sequence of events, but you don't have to look at this statistically to see something very different happened in the second video. And what we see is that there is a huge emotional increase on the positive dimension, on the positive indicator, while users are watching this video of the snowboard. So this is a really great affirmation for our content programming team that, yes, these more delightful content experiences really are having that emotional impact that we were going for with our users. And as we look at the remainder of the video, we actually see some other interesting things too, a little less pronounced. But the positive measure does stay higher when you are looking up snowboarding, getting that results page versus something like finance. And the negative measure stays a little bit lower, so that's a good thing too. So all in all, a very good indication that there's real value in creating these kinds of delightful experiences that goes beyond just touchy-feeliness. So our second question is the more challenging one. So what can biometrics tell us about feature value? So with this, we created 6 different videos showcasing different user stories. Unfortunately, I'm not able to show you the exact stories, those exact videos today due to our licensing agreements, but I do have some storyboards to show. And the real question here was, can we see any difference at all across these different measures? And do people show a difference in how they respond to one feature versus another? So here's one of our stories. So this is the story of Helga. Helga is a business traveler who's in a foreign country where she doesn't speak the language, and she really wants to buy a gift for her friend. So when we meet Helga, she's in the middle of a busy intersection, and people are going all around her, and she has no idea what's going on. So she picks up her phone, and she holds it up to some street signs and shop signs, and it automatically translates them into English. So as she's doing this, she looks around and realizes there's a clock shop. So she goes inside, picks out a gift for her friend, and then proceeds to have a conversation with the shopkeeper using her phone. And as she leaves, we see that she was satisfied with her purchase, and her phone reminds her of her next appointment. So we're running low on time, so I'm just going to fly through this. But the basic takeaway here is we did see some strong emotional responses to this story, and there's some interesting things that happen when you start to show UI on screen. Users responded a lot better to the storytelling elements to when we started to show too much UI. So that was one thing that showed us about so there was a clear positive response to story, but the more we start to get away from the story and show complicated interfaces, it becomes a lot less appealing. The second thing we looked at was the comparisons of different features. So in the first instance, we had the visual translation, and then it moved to the audio translation. And we had much higher responses to the first feature than to the second one. So there does seem to be some diagnostic value to using this measure in this way. And I'm going to skip past this. But the thing that we found was that the features that resonated best were the ones that had relatable pain points and elegant solutions. This is something that we heard time and again from users about why these features were resonating so well with them. So there are some big takeaways about how we use facial EMG effectively for testing software interfaces as opposed to something like an advertisement. It's clear that EMG is great for testing content and user stories. There's a lot of emotional movement when we test those sorts of experiences. But it becomes a lot weaker when you're looking at visual design or anything very complicated like UI. One thing that that we saw in this study was that our stimuli don't need to be perfectly polished to get a good response, and that can be good because that means we don't have to invest as much in adding a lot of music and actors and lighting and things like that. You just need a good story. The last two insights are just around the positive and negative measures. We saw much more movement and clearer results with the positive emotional measure. The negative emotional measure was a little more ambiguous, and it was harder to tell whether people were actually frustrated or if it was more that they were just concentrating on the content. So positive is probably where we will get most of our value, but there is some real potential in looking at the negative emotional measure as well. So what can we do right now if we can't go out and run our own biometric study? Well, there's a lot of things that we can do to create delightful experiences. So first off is the value of delightful content. We don't want to see great content as something frivolous. This has real, meaningful impact for users at a visceral level. So do be looking for places where you can incorporate those delighters into your product. A second thing that we learned is the value of user stories. Emotion and story is very tightly linked, and the more we can incorporate user stories throughout our design process and not just in marketing, the more we're going to create features that really resonate with people. And there are special kinds of features that are especially resonant. So we want to be keeping an eye out for cases where there are pain points that we think that are especially relatable and where we can provide a solution that's a lot simpler than what's out there, because those are things that people seem to really connect to as well. And this point about simplicity is something that we see all across the board when it comes to biometrics. So you don't want to have complicated interfaces, you don't want to have complicated stories. The simpler you can keep things, the more that's going to resonate with users. So I won't belabor this, but we did have some indications that this emotional connection also translates into some practical things for our products as well. So the features that were the most emotionally powerful were also the ones that users said they were most likely to use, they were the most appealing, and they were a lot more memorable. So we had a lot of people mentioning our most emotionally resonant features at the end of the study, even when we didn't ask them about that. So if I can leave you with one thing today, it's that we can't afford to ignore emotion in our products. Emotion is critical in everyday decisions, and it has real implications for product choices as well. We all want to create emotionally compelling products, but wanting and doing are not the same thing, and we can't improve what we don't measure. Fortunately, we don't have to view emotion as unmeasurable. I'm Llewyn Paine, and I have appreciated this opportunity to talk about quantifying delightful design. Any questions? I know we're low on time. Back here?
So I'm kind of confused. So how do you relate adding gratuitous delightful content to a task as opposed to the experience of watching video?
So the question is about delightful content versus task.
So in other words, the Bing engine, I'm going to do a search, and you're putting stuff on the screen.
Yes.
And then you have people passively watching the video. Those
That's right.
seem unconnected.
So I would say that the user stories connect a little better with the task scenario. So in the first set of questions, in the first question, we were really looking to understand whether delightful content has any impact at all. And so there's an entirely separate question around, do people want to have an image on their search homepage? And I think that would be something that's better measured by a non-biometric method. Yeah. Next question? Back here? So the question was about individual differences in biometric levels. So yes, that's a very real issue. People do respond in different ways, and you even get people in these studies who are non-responders. So part of the way we deal with that is by getting a baseline measure right up front. So when people first come in, we have them sit and look at a blank screen for a period of several seconds. And that lets us read what their baseline level is. And then everything else is computed as a change from that baseline. And then we also go through the data afterwards and find people who didn't respond at all, and we throw those out. Yeah. Oh, sorry, yes?
Just to follow up on that.
Sure, yeah.
So I think it's great you're doing that, but I'm wondering also, like, if they have interest that, so that's baseline. Do you do something to kind of look at what they're matching in our, like, I kept looking at the example you had for a low emotional example, that if I were a stockbroker and my gazillion-dollar bonus, if pushed on, you know, the stock market going up a tiny bit, I might be really emotional about that.
Yes. So,
Do you, like, look at people to see what their highs and lows are too?
so the question is around people's individual highs and lows. There are a couple of different philosophies about that. Some people think that you should not you can compute standardized scores where everybody is kind of put on the same scale, and that's one approach that some people take. Other people think that that is losing something, and so there are different schools of thought about that. The other point that you raised is about their level of interest in the subject matter, which I think is also worth looking at. And we did ask some follow-up questions in this study to see who was interested in sports, who was interested in finance. In this particular case, they had some minor effects, but nothing too dramatic. Yeah.
Have you considered rating the delightfulness over the period of time for the same person coming back again and again and seeing every day a new video? Maybe does this fade out over the period of time, or having a blend of this static image and a video sometimes work? By the way, I also work for Paine.
Great. Yeah, so the question was about doing these types of studies longitudinally. And I think that's a great idea. The problem you run into is just the expense of it. Anytime you run a longitudinal study, people will drop out, so you need to recruit even more. But it's a great idea. It would be awesome research to do. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was curious, in your second example about the snowboard, you showed an image of the snowboard, and then did you ask the user to try to snowboard? I mean, there was a simulation, or was the...
Great question. So the videos were just videos. Users weren't interacting directly, and I had to kind of gloss over it quickly. But the reason for that is if you have people interacting directly, you have two issues. One is that they are moving, which means that they're introducing movement artifacts into your signal. And the second issue is that it means everybody's getting a slightly different experience, which means you have to go in and code it differently, and you lose some of your power. By having everybody see the exact same sequence of events at the exact same time, you can tell very easily that everyone's responding to the same thing. Yeah.
Don't you think you may be introducing bias, because you are showing here a snowboard and then another type of snowboard, and the correlation is so close that people may be getting excited at that exists.
Oh, sure. There are always additional places that we can be introducing influences. I wouldn't say bias necessarily, but it would be great to do some follow-up work and see if we can create these same sort of effects, even if we're not looking at snowboarding. Like, I'd love to look at a set of 10 different static homepage images versus 10 moving homepage images. I think we got strong enough responses here to say that there was something about that second video that was pretty delightful, as opposed to just a static image. But there's certainly more research we could do. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
In terms of the user stories and reactions to features, is that something you're using to prioritize your feature roadmap?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
So the testing you did of user stories
Mm-hmm.
and features, are you using that to prioritize your feature roadmap along with other data sources?
So at this point, the goal is just to figure out whether there's any potential there for using it in that way. What we think that these sorts of user stories might be able to tell us is which of our features are going to be kind of the standout ones that people are really excited about. That doesn't take the place of business metrics and other reasons to other product priorities. But I think that there is some potential for rolling something like this into our roadmap planning.
So then what all new features?
In this example, as of the time of testing, which was a while back, they were all recently launched features, but ones that we thought that people wouldn't actually have familiarity with. Yeah. Yes?
This might be really hard to measure. But I'm curious, with data that's so subtle, how confident are you that this represents the experience out in users of real environments?
Okay, so the question is kind of external validity of the study. This is a concern for all of biometrics because you do have to control the environment so much. So there is a question about how much this extends beyond. My gut feeling, I can't give you a definite answer here, but my gut feel is that you are uncovering something real and legitimate, and that there, especially when we're talking about the delight measure. That being said, there's so much else going on in the external world, and there are so many other distractions that I imagine the effects here that we're seeing would be muted and influenced by those other factors. But now that there are starting to be a lot more accessible forms of biometrics available, I can imagine that in 5 years we might be able to answer those questions a lot better. Yeah. Any other questions? Oh, yes?
In addition to the biometric data that you collected for either the videos or the user stories, did you also collect sort of the traditional qualitative word bank or that sort of thing?
Not in this study. So as I mentioned, we had tested a lot of this content in the past in various ways. So we do sort of have an existing library of literature that we can compare this to. But in this particular study, the only self-report that we did was in that post-session questionnaire. Yeah. Did you have a question about anything with that within that?
I was just curious, like, how much more did you get out of the biometrics that you couldn't have gotten with, $0 methods?
That's a great question. And I think the reason why biometrics were valuable here was because we were trying to answer questions of degree. It wasn't it wasn't to the previous question about, do users even want to have an image on their homepage? That's not what we were trying to answer here. We were trying to look at if there is going to be something on the homepage, is it more delightful if we have something that's moving? And so I think that's the real value here. We actually did get some pretty good correlation between memory measures, so just asking people, which of these features did you remember best afterwards? That showed us similar results, but it definitely didn't completely overlap. Yeah. All right, is that all the questions? Okay, thank you all so much.